On an ordinary afternoon in the quiet heart of a small Ohio neighborhood, the local grocery store buzzed with the familiar hum of daily life. Carts squeaked along the polished floors, children laughed and tugged at their parents' sleeves, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh bread and ripened produce. It was a scene of simple, predictable comfort, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone, where greetings were exchanged at every aisle and smiles were offered without a second thought. The sun outside poured golden light through the wide front windows, casting long, warm beams across the tile floors. Elderly couples discussed dinner plans near the meat counter, while teenagers wandered the snack aisle, debating over sodas and candy. There was a rhythm to it all, a soothing, easy tempo that wrapped the store and its visitors in a sense of belonging, of routine. Life here on this sunny afternoon moved with the gentle pace of a town untouched by the urgency of bigger cities. Among the shoppers was an elderly woman, no different from the others at first glance. She wore a faded, cream-colored cardigan, and her silver hair was pinned neatly in place. Adjusting her glasses with an impatient huff, she muttered under her breath as she examined a pyramid of apples, her movements sharp, her demeanor closed off. Nearby, a young black man, tall, relaxed, dressed in a blue hoodie and worn jeans, maneuvered his basket skillfully with one hand while texting on his phone with the other. His name was Darrell. To most, he was just another face among many, blending seamlessly into the easygoing flow of the day. But fate has a way of slicing through the fabric of normalcy without warning. As Darrell reached for a bag of oranges, stepping briefly into the woman's periphery, the air seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, a tension, an invisible tightening, as if the store itself sensed what was about to break loose. The woman's eyes sharpened, her mouth drew into a hard line, and the piece that had hung so easily in the air began to crack at its edges. For a heartbeat, everything remained still. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, checkout scanners beeped in the distance, and a baby cried softly in a cart 2 aisles over. But near the produce stand, a storm was quietly gathering. Without warning, the elderly woman's voice cut sharply across the aisle, loud enough for strangers to hear. "You people don't belong here," she snapped, her words slicing through the store like a knife. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The hum of the store collapsed into an uncomfortable silence, thick and heavy, as dozens of eyes darted the sudden commotion. Darrell froze mid-motion, his fingers still hovering above his phone. The ordinary, easygoing afternoon had shattered like glass, and in the shards of that silence, something far bigger than groceries was about to unfold. The moment shattered the easy rhythm of the grocery store like a hammer to glass. Darrell, caught mid-text, blinked in disbelief, his mind stumbling to catch up with the reality of the words that had just been thrown at him. "You people don't belong here," the elderly woman repeated, her voice cutting harshly through the stunned silence. She stood rigid, her frail hands tightening around a plastic bag of apples as if it were a shield. Her face, wrinkled and weathered by decades of life, was twisted in a scowl that carried more weight than her body ever could. For a heartbeat, Darrell couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around him thickened, heavy and claustrophobic. Conversations that had once floated harmlessly through the aisles died mid-sentence. Carts sat abandoned. Shoppers froze in awkward half-steps, pretending to inspect boxes of cereal or cans of soup, but their ears strained toward the confrontation, crackling like static in the air. Darrell's hand slowly lowered his phone to his side. His pulse pounded in his ears, but his face remained unreadable, a mask carefully stitched together over years of learning when to speak and when silence screamed louder. And then came the second blow. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" she barked, louder now, her voice sharp and shaking, as though daring him to retaliate. A few shoppers winced audibly. A woman near the bakery clutched her toddler closer. An elderly man in the frozen foods section adjusted his hearing aid, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Darrell felt the words slam into him, harder than any shove or punch. They weren't just aimed at him. They echoed backward through generations, reverberating off the lives of his ancestors who had endured far worse in the name of simply existing. He could feel every eye in the produce section burning into him, waiting, judging, fearing. For one searing second, rage boiled under his skin, hot, primal, immediate. His muscles tensed, his jaw clenched, the urge to lash back like a whip rising fast. He could have shouted, he could have cursed, he could have stormed out, leaving the woman stewing in her own hatred. But he didn't. Instead, Darrell drew a long, slow breath that seemed to pull the entire grocery store taut with tension. His chest rose and fell deliberately as he pushed the anger down into a place where it couldn't control him. His fingers, still trembling faintly, gripped the handle of his basket tighter. The old woman's eyes bore into him, her expression expectant, almost smug, as if certain that whatever happened next would prove her right. But Darrell didn't give her that satisfaction. When he finally lifted his gaze, his face was a mask of calm steel. His voice, when it came, was quiet, so quiet that the entire store leaned closer to hear it. "Ma'am," he said, his tone low and steady, "do you even realize what you just said?" The question, simple as it was, hung heavy in the air like thunder waiting to break. For a moment, Darrell stood rooted to the spot, the grocery basket heavy in his hand, the entire world seeming to narrow down to a single, suffocating point between him and the woman before him. Every instinct screamed for release, for the sharp retort, the anger, the demand for respect that he had earned simply by existing, by surviving, by building a life in a country that wasn't always built for people like him. 1,000 words lined up, burning at the back of his throat, each one sharper than the last. But Darrell didn't speak yet. Instead, he closed his eyes for half a second, drawing the kind of breath that had been taught to him by generations before him. Men and women who had learned that sometimes strength wasn't in the loudest voice, but in the calm that could silence a room. When he opened his eyes again, the store around him had become a stage of frozen players. The young cashier craning her neck from behind the register, the teenage stock boy frozen mid-stack of bananas, the mother holding her child just a little closer to her hip. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to have quieted, waiting, straining for what would come next. Darrell shifted his basket to his other hand with slow, deliberate care, as if grounding himself to the earth. His presence seemed to expand, not with anger, but with something far more powerful: command. The elderly woman adjusted her cardigan with a huff, lifting her chin higher, her glare daring him to lash out, to fulfill whatever ugly expectations she harbored. She was so certain, so sure, that he would lose control, that she could dismiss him the moment he raised his voice. But Darrell knew better. He understood that real power wasn't about shouting louder. Real power was about owning the moment so completely that no one could look away. No one could deny the truth when it was finally spoken. He let the silence stretch, longer than comfortable, longer than polite, until the woman fidgeted, until the weight of her own words began pressing back on her. When Darrell spoke, his voice was low, calm, but there was no mistaking the steel threaded through it. "You said I don't belong here," he said, each word precise, unhurried, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "You said I should go back to Africa." The woman's mouth twitched, but she said nothing, perhaps realizing too late that this would not be an easy dismissal. Darrell took a single step forward, not aggressive but firm, closing the distance just enough to make sure she heard every syllable. "I'm going to answer you," he said, his voice growing in strength without ever rising in volume, not with anger, not with hate, but with the truth. And in that moment the air shifted again, not with fear this time, but with anticipation. Everyone could feel it. The storm was coming, not a storm of fists or fury, but a storm of truth, and there would be no shelter from it. The silence in the grocery store was no longer just awkward, it was electric, crackling with the weight of something about to change. Darrell let his words hang in the air a moment longer before stepping fully into the stillness he had created. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried a force that made every head in the nearby aisles turn, made every breath seem to still. "You said I don't belong here," Darrell began, his gaze locked firmly on the woman. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." He shifted his stance, straightening, his presence filling the space in a way that made the old woman visibly tense, and yet somehow she couldn't look away. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," Darrell said, his voice rich with memory and pain. "He didn't come here on a plane. He didn't come here for opportunity. He was dragged here, stolen from his home, shackled in chains, beaten until his spirit bent but never broke. A sharp breath sounded from a woman standing near the bakery. Even the stock boy stacking bananas had stopped, a bunch still clutched in his hand. My family, Darrell continued, his voice gaining strength, worked land they would never own, building wealth for people who never saw them as human. They broke their backs so that the foundation of this country could stand. The woman clutched her bag of apples tighter, her knuckles whitening, but she said nothing. She didn't dare. Darrell's voice softened, but the sorrow within it made the words even heavier. My grandfather, he said, fought in World War II, wore the uniform of a country that sent him to bleed and die for freedom, but wouldn't let him sit at the same lunch counter when he came home. A murmur rippled through the crowd, now gathering more openly. Strangers exchanged glances, some ashamed, some angry on his behalf. And my parents? Darrell said, his gaze sweeping across the faces around him now, making sure every single person could hear. My mother is a teacher, spent her life lifting children up, no matter their color. My father is a mechanic, the kind of man who would stop and fix a stranger's car in the pouring rain, even if they looked at him like he didn't belong. He paused, letting the weight of their sacrifices settle on the room like a heavy, undeniable truth. You think I don't belong? He asked, his voice low but full of thunder. My family helped build this country. They fought for it. They bled for it. They believed in its promise, even when it didn't believe in them. The old woman's face had gone pale. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Darrell's final words were a whisper that somehow carried louder than any shout. I have more claim to this land in my blood than you could ever imagine. And with that, the spell was broken. Not with anger, not with violence, but with the raw, undeniable power of truth. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The grocery store, once buzzing with casual chatter and clinking carts, stood utterly still. Darrell's words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. Impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. The old woman's hand trembled where it clutched her apples, her face a canvas of shock, confusion, and something deeper, shame. The silence broke, not with a roar, but with a simple, trembling voice. He's right. A middle-aged man near the dairy aisle said, stepping forward. His ball cap was pulled low over his brow, and his voice cracked as he spoke. We've got to be better than this. The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward. Another voice rose, soft but sure. An older woman near the frozen food section, her hands wrapped tightly around the handle of her cart, nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. My daddy fought in that same war, she said, her voice quivering. He always told me the only color that matters is the red in the flag. The spell shattered completely. The young cashier at the front, barely 20, called out from behind her register, her voice bright and unsteady. I've never seen anyone handle hate like that, she said, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. A murmur rose through the crowd. Approval, agreement, solidarity. People began stepping closer, no longer pretending not to notice, no longer hiding behind their shopping carts and baskets. Their faces, once cautious and uncertain, now reflected something else entirely: admiration, respect, hope. Even the teenage stock boy, still clutching a bruised banana, found his voice. That was amazing, man, he stammered, awe shining in his wide eyes. The old woman, now visibly shaken, looked around as if searching for an ally, someone who might rescue her from the tidal wave she had unleashed. But there was no rescue coming, no approving nods, no silent support, only the quiet, firm wall of a community choosing to stand on the right side of history. Her lips parted, and for a moment it seemed like she might say something, an apology perhaps. But the words caught in her throat, tangled and too heavy to lift. Instead she turned, her steps faltering, and pushed her cart toward the exit with a kind of defeated urgency, disappearing into the fading light outside. As she left, a slow clap broke the stillness. It started with the man in the ball cap. One clap, then two, and then others joined. The sound grew, swelling into a standing ovation that filled the store with raw, unfiltered emotion. People weren't clapping for anger. They weren't clapping for spectacle. They were clapping for courage, for truth. Darrell, basket still in hand, stood in the center of it all, not smiling, not basking, but standing tall, steady, the living proof that dignity could turn even the ugliest moment into a lesson the world desperately needed to hear. And though the applause eventually faded, the change it sparked would echo far beyond the aisles of that little store. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden fingers of light across the parking lot. The old woman gripped the steering wheel of her sedan so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her body rigid against the seat. She didn't start the car. She just sat there, frozen, the world moving in slow motion around her. Inside her chest, a war raged, a battle between stubborn pride and something far more unsettling: doubt. Daryl's words played over and over in her mind, each syllable striking harder than the last. She had expected him to shout, to lash out, to prove her worst assumptions true, but he hadn't. Instead, he had stood there, calm, unshaken, and spoken truth so raw, so deeply woven into the soil of the country she loved, that she couldn't look away. And now, seated alone in her car, the full weight of what she had said came crashing down. For the first time in a long time, she thought of her grandchildren, bright-eyed, curious little souls who would one day inherit this world. What kind of example had she set for them? What kind of poison had she risked passing down with her careless words? Her reflection in the rearview mirror looked unfamiliar. The tightly pinned hair, the cardigan she had worn for years, it all seemed like a costume now, flimsy armor against the deeper truth pressing on her heart. In her mind, she saw Daryl's face, not angry, not cruel, but calm, strong, deeply human. She saw the faces of the people who had stood with him, strangers who had found their voices when she had lost her way. Tears stung her eyes, unbidden and unwelcome. She remembered her father, a World War II veteran like Daryl's grandfather, who had once told her that America was a promise, not a guarantee, but a promise they had to keep alive. She realized now how easily she had forgotten that, how easily she had let fear and habit twist that promise into something smaller, something uglier. The minutes ticked by. Shoppers drifted past her car, their carts rattling over the pavement, their lives continuing while hers had come to an uncomfortable, necessary halt. She didn't start the engine. She couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she sat there and let herself feel it, the shame, the regret, the painful cracking open of a heart that had been too tightly closed for far too long. Inside the store, life was returning to normal, but nothing truly felt the same. She could sense it, even from here, the way people moved differently, spoke with a little more kindness, a little more care. And for the first time in many years, the old woman realized that maybe change wasn't just for the young. Maybe it was for anyone brave enough to let the truth break them open and start again. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, she finally reached for the ignition, her hands still trembling. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, she would begin again. The story of what happened at the grocery store didn't stay within its walls. By the next morning, it had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, passed along over coffee cups, whispered between coworkers, retold at dinner tables with a mix of shock, admiration, and a strange, unfamiliar sense of hope. It wasn't just another incident. It had become something bigger. A moment that cracked the surface of people's comfort and demanded they look deeper. In the local diner, where regulars usually talked about weather and high school football scores, Daryl's name was spoken with quiet reverence. "Did you hear what that young man said?" one elderly man asked, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "He didn't yell, didn't curse, just told the truth," another added, shaking his head in wonder, "louder than any shouting ever could." At the nearby elementary school, a teacher used the story as a lesson for her fourth graders, not about anger, but about courage and compassion. She spoke about how standing up for what's right sometimes means staying calm when every bone in your body wants to explode. She told her students that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they carry grocery baskets. Neighbors who had known each other for years but never spoken about race, about history, about pain, suddenly found themselves having uncomfortable but necessary conversations. "I guess we all have blind spots," one woman confessed to her friend as they walked their dogs. "I never thought about it that way before." Not really. The story even made its way to the local paper. The headline was simple but powerful: "A stand of dignity, how one man's calm changed a community." Below it, a grainy photo, someone had snapped it in the grocery store without anyone noticing, captured Darrell standing tall, his basket at his feet, facing the elderly woman with a quiet, commanding strength that spoke volumes. And Darrell? He went about his days much the same, working, living, being, never seeking attention for what he had done. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought only of his parents, his grandparents, his ancestors, and the promise he had made silently in his heart to carry their legacy forward with grace, no matter how heavy the burden. Strangers began approaching him at gas stations, in parking lots, at the post office. Some offered handshakes. Others simply nodded with tears glistening in their eyes. A few shared their own stories, moments when they had stayed silent and wished they hadn't, or when someone else's courage had lit a fire inside them that never went out. Darrell listened. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he hugged them. Always he carried their words carefully, adding them to the growing collection of quiet hopes he kept tucked deep inside his heart. Because he understood now, more than ever, change didn't come all at once. It came in ripples, small, stubborn, beautiful. And sometimes all it took was one voice refusing to be silenced to set them in motion. In the quiet that followed, long after the last whispers of the story had drifted through the neighborhood, something far more important remained. It wasn't the memory of the confrontation itself that lingered. It was the way Darrell had chosen to face it, with a dignity that demanded attention, with a truth so raw and undeniable that it carved itself into the hearts of everyone who heard it. His calm voice, his steady gaze, his refusal to meet hate with hate. They had done something no outburst ever could. They had planted a seed. And seeds, once planted, have a way of growing. Across town, conversations that had once seemed too uncomfortable to have now bloomed naturally around kitchen tables and across fences. People didn't just whisper about injustice, they named it. They didn't just shake their heads at ignorance, they challenged it. They didn't just stand by silently anymore. They chose, even in small ways, to speak up, because they had seen firsthand what courage looked like when wrapped not in anger, but in truth. Darrell understood something that day, something deeper than pride, deeper even than pain. He knew that real change rarely explodes in grand moments. It begins in the unseen places, in a grocery store aisle, in the uncertain flicker in a stranger's eye, in the quiet conviction of a heart that refuses to harden. He had chosen not to lash out. He had chosen not to walk away. Instead, he had held up a mirror, not just to the woman who had insulted him, but to every person who had stood by and watched. And what they saw reflected back wasn't just Darrell, it was themselves. That's the true power of words, of actions. They can slice and divide, or they can heal and rebuild. They can poison, or they can purify. Every choice, every word, every moment matters. Standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means standing still when your legs want to run, speaking quietly when your heart pounds with rage, choosing dignity when vengeance would be so much easier. Darrell didn't change the world in one afternoon, but he changed the room. He changed the store. He changed the hearts of the people who witnessed what grace under fire truly looked like. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the world changes anyway. Not all at once, but one room, one heart, one brave soul at a time. So if you ever find yourself facing a moment like Darrell's, remember this. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Even the smallest stand for what is right can echo louder and longer than you ever imagined. Sometimes the most powerful way to fight hatred isn't by matching its fury, it's by refusing to let it change who you are. And in doing so, you remind the world of what real strength, real courage, and real hope look like. Life often teaches us that true strength isn't shown through shouting or anger, but through calmness, dignity, and truth. In moments of injustice, it can be easy to react with fury, but real courage lies in standing firm with grace, letting your words heal rather than hurt. Darrell's story reminds us that every small action, every steady voice can ripple outward to touch hearts we may never see. Especially for those of us who have lived through decades of change, it is a powerful reminder. We still have the ability to shape the world around us. Our words, our choices, even in ordinary places like a grocery store, can either divide or unite, harm or heal. No matter our age, our example still matters. By choosing dignity over rage, by speaking the truth with calm conviction, We plant seeds of understanding for the generations that follow. We show that kindness, respect, and courage are not weaknesses. They are the quiet strengths that hold a community and a nation together. Let us never underestimate the power we still have to make a difference, simply by choosing to be better, even when it's hardest.